Suffering hook pulls has got to be one of the most frustrating things in carp fishing. But what if I told you that this is something that very rarely happens to me? Now, I'm not trying to boast here. I'm just trying to tell you that if you get everything right in your fishing, your rigs are perfect and everything is absolutely spot on, then you shouldn't really be losing many fish to hook pulls. So in this video, I'm going to go through all my tips and tactics for making sure you land more carp and have a lot less hook pulls. Now, it's fairly obvious that to catch carp, you need to have a really sharp hook. So I'm not going to go into that in this video. It's been said way too many times before, but it's more the other aspects of your rigs and your presentation that you need to get right to make sure that you get the best possible hook holds, because at the end of the day, the hook hold is your connection between the carp and your fishing rod. And if the hook hold isn't right, then you're much more likely to lose the fish. So I'm going to talk you through how I make sure that the hook hold is absolutely perfect for different situations, and therefore make sure that any fish that you hook should end up in the bottom of your landing net. So something that is often overlooked in carp fishing that makes a massive difference to how good your hook holds are and how deep the hook penetrates when the fish picks it up is the tightness of your clutches on your reels. Now, a lot of people, it used to be the fashion to have really slack clutches, and so when you get a take, you get a screaming run, and you know, everyone loves the sound of that, don't they? But I would argue that the slack line that gives the fish allows them to kind of run with it, and it's not pulling the hook in for you. It's not doing the job of striking that you would do if you were holding the rod in your hand. So I have the clutches really tight, whether I'm snag fishing or open water or whatever. Clutches are really tight. I just take about 2 or 3 clicks off the front drag on my reels, just enough that the rod's not going to get pulled in, but the fish has to work really hard to take any line. So literally that there, you know, it's pretty tight, and it's not going to let the fish run for like 40 yards before I get to the rod. You know, it's going to keep them close to where I've hooked them from, so they're not going to get in any danger, but also the more they pull, the better the hook hold is getting. I've also got my line clip there, so the line is actually locked in there, so the fish has to pull quite hard to get that out of there before it then hits the clutch. So it's kind of doing the job of striking for you and giving you a much better hook hold. Another really important factor to consider when trying to avoid hook pulls in carp fishing is to make sure that your setup is balanced. Now, what do I mean by this? Simply, I mean that the amount of force that you're exerting with the rod at your end needs to balance the amount of pressure that's at the other end and how hard the fish is going to be pulling, and the hook hold, how secure that is. So you can get away with a slightly softer rod on smaller fish, for instance, and smaller hooks, but the more powerful your rod, the higher the test curve, the bigger hook you need to be using. And especially if you're fishing for bigger fish that are going to pull harder, you need to step everything up to kind of balance that out. So generally lighter rods, smaller hooks for smaller fish, and more powerful rods, bigger hooks for bigger fish, but also different angling situations such as snag fishing, fishing around weeds, lilies, that sort of thing. You might need to step up the size of the hook to improve your hook holds, and a slightly stronger rod, obviously you're going to be able to pull the fish away from danger with a bigger hook and a stronger rod. So just think about balancing your setup for the situation you fish in, the size of the fish, how hard you think they're going to be pulling, and how much power you're going to be putting in with your rod. One thing that I do often see, which is definitely going to lead to more hook pulls, is people rushing the fight when they're playing a fish. The idea is that you're going to be tiring the fish out before you try and get it in the net. I see some people, as soon as they've hooked it, you know, they're pumping it back, winding. Seems like all they want to do is get it in the net so they can have a picture and then sit back down and chill out again. When actually the fight is one of the most enjoyable parts of carp fishing, I think anyway. And there's a real skill and an art to getting it right so that you don't lose fish. What I tend to do is use the clutch for most of the fight, so you adjust the tension or the drag, if you like, on the reel to balance with the amount of force that the fish is putting in. So it goes back to that balanced setup. But if the fish starts running and trying to pull line, you're not going to try and resist it. You just release a little bit of tension on the drag and let the fish run. And then what I like to do when the fish gets a bit closer in, nearer to the net, is then disengage the anti-reverse so that you can actually back wind for that last bit of the fight. I just find it's a little bit more intuitive and a bit more in control when it gets to that critical bit. I like to be able to just release line at will rather than waiting for the clutch to sort of kick in and do its job. So most of the fight, when the fish is out in the lake and it's trying to pull and go and runs, you're letting it go with the clutch or the drag. But then when it gets close in, a little bit of back winding, just so you can kind of let off enough line so that you've got a decent drop between the rod tip and the rig and the fish, so that when you pull back, it's going to come over the net instead of pulling straight up and kind of ripping the hook out of the fish. So really, really important, guys. Don't rush the fight with the fish. Try and take your time, try and enjoy it, and you'll definitely land a lot more carp. Right, another reason for getting bad hook holds and therefore losing carp is tangled rigs. Now, it's an obvious one. You definitely don't want your rig to be tangled when you put it out in a lake, but the reason why it can cause hook pulls is because it actually shortens your rig. So you think you're fishing with a 9-inch rig, for instance, but if it's wrapped around the lead a couple of times, it could very easily end up as like a 4-inch rig, and if the carp kind of sucks and blows, it's just going to spit it out and get away with it. And quite often, if I have lost a fish, unfortunately to a hook pull, when I've wound in, the rig's been tangled, and I've realised that that's the reason for it. So what can you do to avoid tangles? Well, obviously things like PVA bags are good. So you either fish like a PVA stick slid down your rig to stop it tangling, gives it a bit of extra weight when you're casting, and also the end section of the hook is all inside, so there's no way it can wrap around. Obviously solid bags are good as well. You could fish a little stringer with boilies, but one of the most important ways to stop tangles is your casting. So when you cast out, make sure you slow the line down with your finger. It's called feathering it. So that allows the rig to straighten out in the air. The weight of the hook bait will pull the rig away from the lead, and as it drops into the lake, it'll land in a nice straight line on the surface rather than landing in a heap. And then you feel the lead down, so you keep the line trapped with your finger, and as the lead's falling through the water, you keep a tight line, which again keeps the rig straight and away from the lead, and then you'll feel the bottom, and then the rig should lay nicely away from the lead as it drops down a little bit after the lead's hit the bottom. This also lets you know what substrate you're fishing over by how hard that impact is when the lead hits the bottom. But the most important thing is that it stops the rig from tangling. You can also use dissolving foam nuggets, which are really good. Again, it just gives that little sort of almost parachute effect to the hook and the hook bait. So when you're casting, you know, it keeps it pulled back away from the lead, but then obviously when it drops through the water, it's going to be buoyant, so it holds it up and stops it wrapping around the lead. So all these things can come together and help you stop tangles, and therefore help you stop losing carp. Right, the next tip that I can give you to avoid hook pulls is all to do with your lead system. Now, it's very, very common and popular these days for people to fish lead clips, and they tend to push the tail rubber on really hard so there's no way that lead can come off, and use a kind of a fixed swivel in there as well. Now, not only is this a dangerous way to fish because the fish can't get rid of the lead in the event of a crack off, but also the fish can use the weight of the lead to shake its head and get rid of the rig once it's picked it up. So what I tend to do, and this has really, really made a big difference in my fishing, I either fish the lead to drop off, which you know is expensive and may be bad for the environment in the lakes. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but if you're fishing a weedy lake, it can really help you. But what I really like doing is fishing a semi-fixed kind of running setup. So what I mean by that is you have the swivel so that it can pull out of your inline lead or your lead clip, squeeze it down a bit so it's not such a tight fit, and it pulls out quite easily under a little bit of tension, and that can really, really help you land a lot more fish. Believe me, it's made such a difference in my angling, because when the fish picks it up, it gets hooked by the weight of the lead, shakes its head, and then the swivel pulls out and the lead starts sliding away up the line. You get much better bite indication, and the fish cannot shake out that rig, so you're not going to get dodgy hook holes where it's kind of skidded. You know, sometimes you pick up the rod and you feel the fish kind of shaking its head, and then you get a hook pull, and I think that's where they're using that lead to shake it out. So another really important thing to consider when you're carp fishing is your rig mechanics. This can really make the difference between hooking a fish and landing it and hooking a fish and losing it. What do I mean by rig mechanics? Well, basically it's kind of the actual movement of the rig, how it turns when a fish picks it up, how the hook behaves and how the bait behaves in relation to it, and everything that goes into making that hook a mechanical tool to hook in the fish. Now, there's lots and lots of factors involved in this, and I may do a separate video on it altogether. But the basic points, the kind of summary really, for me, is that if you've got a buoyant bait, you need that bait to be nearer to the eye of the hook when it's sitting on the rig. So something like a D-rig is good, or if you have a hair, have it exiting kind of opposite the point, no further round the bend than that, when you've got a buoyant bait. And that way, when the fish picks it up, the hook can drop down, it makes the point heavier, the bait is light, so the point gets heavier and it drops it down and hooks the fish in the bottom lip. If you're using a heavier bait, such as a bottom bait, then you want the bait to be exiting nearer the bend, which again makes the point heavier, so that when the fish picks it up and the bait drops down in the fish's mouth, the hook point will also drop down, and then hopefully the fish swims off and it drags the hook into the fish's mouth that way. So the more buoyant the bait, the nearer the eye you want your hair to exit, and the more heavy your bait, the nearer the bend you want it to exit. Now, another part of rig mechanics is the flexibility in the rig. So if you're using a coated braid or a stripped back braid, like an uncoated braid, the idea of that is it's going to have some sort of suppleness near to the hook. And if you feel braid when it first comes off the spool, quite often it's really tightly packed and tightly woven, and it's not actually as supple as you'd expect it to be, so the hook can't really turn and do its job and go in from any angle the fish sucks it. So what I do is I kind of rub the braid between my fingers, kind of ruffle it about a bit, make sure it's got all those fibres loosened, and it makes it a hell of a lot more supple. And if you want to have a supple rig, you might as well make it as supple as it can be. And for me, that makes a real difference with how the rig performs when I test it in my palm, but also it seems to make a difference on where my hook is in the fish's mouth and my hook to land ratio as well. Another part of rig mechanics which I think helps you get better hook holes is to have some sort of weight on the hook link itself. So obviously if you're using a pop-up, you're going to have some sort of counterweight for your pop-up, so a shot normally, or a bit of putty depending on what you prefer. But also I'll have a little bit of putty further down, about halfway, which just helps the rig kind of drop down when the fish picks it up, drops it into the bottom of the fish's mouth, which is where we need to hook them. Because you've got a lead weight on the bottom, it makes sense to try and hook the fish in the bottom lip really. And obviously if you're not using a pop-up, you're not going to have a shot on there, so you'd use a bit of putty near the hook as well, which just really helps that turning effect of the rig and helps you get better hook holes. To be honest with you, since I started doing that, my hook holes really improved, and obviously I landed a lot more fish because of it. Another factor to consider with rig mechanics is the size of your bait compared to the size of your hook. If you're using a relatively large bait, say 18 mil, 20, 22 mil, something like that, you don't want to be using a small size 8 or size 6 hook really. The size of the bait will restrict the ability of the hook to get in the bottom lip of the mouth of the carp, because obviously it's higher up when it's touching the bottom of the carp's mouth. It lifts the hook up out of the way. So you want a bigger hook, such as a size 4, that's going to have a lot more metal and be sort of protruding beyond those baits, and hopefully give you a better chance of a hook hole. On the flip side of that, the smaller the bait, you can get away with a bigger hook, but I like to have a balanced setup. I think I was talking about it earlier. The more sort of matching the bait your hook is, the better, I think, because a really heavy hook will make the bait behave unnaturally. So a smaller bait, like pieces of fake corn or small 12mm boilies or something like that, I like to use maybe like a size 6 hook, so that it's a bit more subtle, easier to suck in, and it sort of matches the size of the bait a lot better. One massively important part of rig mechanics is the rig length. If you get the rig length wrong, it'll lead to poorly hooked carp and obviously losing a lot more fish. So for more information on how to choose the rig length, please click on this video over here. And also, if you would like more carp fishing tips, there's a playlist down here with lots of information that I think will really help you out.